Welcome to this explainer. I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here today because we're about to go on a really fascinating journey into how athletics literally changed history. We so often think of sports as just, well, entertainment, a weekend distraction, a chance to grab a drink and cheer for our favorite teams. But what happens when the lines on a playing field become the actual front lines of a massive social struggle? Today, we're diving deep into the fight for non-racial sport in South Africa. It's this incredible story of profound division, unbelievable resilience, and ultimately, the unifying power of a simple game. So how exactly did a simple game become a vital battleground for human rights? Well, for decades in South Africa, playing a game of soccer or rugby, it wasn't just about scoring points. Under the intensely oppressive system of apartheid, literally every single aspect of life was strictly segregated by race, and sport was absolutely no exception. For a long time, it was a mirror reflecting the injustices of society, but eventually, it actually became a powerful hammer used to shatter those very same injustices. Nelson Mandela had this truly unique understanding of sport's ability to bridge deep-seated divides. He once noted that, if sportsmen take steps to remove the color bar, it must be taken into account. He recognized, way before many others, that the universal language of sport could bring people together, even folks who had been forcefully kept apart for centuries based on race. He saw that if sports could integrate, it would show the rest of the country that living together and sharing power wasn't actually something to be terrified of.
Okay, let's jump into Section 1, Origins of Segregated Sport.
To really understand the roots of this whole thing, we have to look at how sport was initially weaponized for control. Back in the 1920s, the Chamber of Mines heavily promoted soccer among their workers. Now let's be real, this wasn't out of the goodness of their hearts. These migrant miners were living in terrible, incredibly lonely conditions, working for practically nothing. The mine bosses quickly realized that if the workers were busy playing and watching soccer on their weekends, they wouldn't have the time or the energy to sit around thinking about their terrible lives, or worse, to organize and revolt. It was a very deliberate tool for distraction and compliance.
And that early control quickly birthed some really bitter rivalries. Take the Johannesburg Bantu Football Association, or JBFA, which was tightly controlled by the municipality. Now, the local residents absolutely hated the municipality because of the constant police harassment they faced. Because of that, a lot of teams fiercely refused to join the JBFA, flocking instead to the independent Johannesburg African Football Association, or JFA. This massive tension laid the groundwork for decades of deep political divides within the sport itself.
If you look at the sporting landscape before 1951, it was entirely fractured, just completely separate associations based entirely on race. But then, in 1951, a huge shift happens. The so-called African, Colored, and Indian leagues made this incredibly courageous decision to merge. They formed the non-racial South African Soccer Federation, the SASF. However, the white leagues and the municipal-controlled leagues, they chose to remain segregated. So the lines were now permanently drawn in the sand.
Moving right along to Section 2, the international boycott begins.
As the apartheid government tightened its grip domestically, this internal resistance started sparking a massive wave of global isolation. And, you'd probably assume soccer or rugby led the charge here, right? Well, surprisingly, the pathfinder was actually table tennis in the 1950s. I know, crazy. But this set a massive precedent. By 1964, South Africa was formally expelled from the Olympic Games after flat-out refusing to send an integrated team. And get this, in 1976, African nations staged a massive boycott of the Montreal Olympics simply because New Zealand had allowed their rugby team, the All Blacks, to tour apartheid South Africa. The international pressure was becoming just immense. As Mary Corrigal's report to the UN highlighted, this first victory in the field of table tennis was a huge moral triumph. When the International Table Tennis Federation refused to recognize the all-white South African Union and chose to recognize the non-racial board instead, it proved something vital. It proved that international sporting bodies didn't just have to sit back and accept apartheid. It set the precedent that inspired the broader, much more famous sports boycotts that would soon follow. And we need to be clear here, these boycotts weren't just, symbolic protests. They were powerful diplomatic weapons. The UN actually compiled a literal register of sports contacts, basically a blacklist of athletes who competed in South Africa to apply heavy moral pressure and essentially shame them on a global scale. FIFA also played a massive role, steadfastly refusing to sanctify apartheid by keeping South Africa banned from international soccer. This total, crushing isolation made the apartheid ideology increasingly unviable on the world stage. All right, Section 3, Internal Resistance and Rivalries. So while the international community was acting, the battle on the ground back home was incredibly fierce. When the non-racial SASL was formed in 1961, municipalities actively tried to crush it. How? By totally denying them access to playing fields and giving all the resources to the segregated NPSL instead. The non-racial teams were essentially starved out. It took decades of breakaways, resilience, and constantly reforming leagues, like the FPL and eventually the NSL in 1985, before a truly powerful, unified professional body could actually begin to take shape against the government's wishes. It was a grueling fight. And we definitely have to recognize the dedicated internal organizations driving all this resistance. Groups like SASA, Sonrock, SACOS, and the NOSC. They were the unsung heroes of this era. These were intense coalitions of activists and athletes who fought tirelessly decade after decade, from 1959 all the way up to the end of apartheid. They were the ones on the ground lobbying the international community, organizing those non-racial leagues, and demanding unity in the face of intense government persecution.
Which brings us to Section 4, Reconciliation through Sport.
As the 1990s approached, the apartheid regime finally began to crumble, and sport was dramatically inverted. It went from being a tool of division to a tool for national healing. Historian Derek Charles Katzum analyzes this beautifully in his work. With the election of Nelson Mandela in 1994, South Africa was suddenly welcomed back into the international sporting community. But, as Katzum asks, could sport actually bring harmony to a nation that had been so deeply traumatized by its own history? Well, the dramatic shift was just staggering. Think about this. In 1981, when the all-white Springbok rugby team toured New Zealand, they were met with violent, passionate anti-apartheid protests. South Africa was a total global pariah. Yet, just 14 years later, South Africa is hosting the 1995 Rugby World Cup and playing New Zealand in the final. Mandela famously walks out wearing the Springbok jersey, and the entire world celebrated the match as this incredible redemptive symbol of a new, democratic rainbow nation. Talk about a 180, right? But the story isn't quite over. Let's look at Section 5, the unfinished game. It's an amazing story, and it's been famously depicted in Hollywood movies. But the reality on the ground is quite a bit more complex. As Katzum points out, while the sporting isolation has ended, the linkages between sport and politics absolutely have not. Sport in South Africa today reveals both the incredible, monumental distance the country has traveled, but also exactly how far it still has to go to surmount that bitter legacy of white supremacy. It's an unfinished game. A perfect example of this ongoing tension is the Springbok emblem itself. For white Afrikaners, rugby remains almost like a civic religion, and the Springbok is deeply beloved. However, for millions of Black South Africans, that exact same emblem is still intensely hated. It's seen as a historical symbol of racist white supremacy at its absolute apex. Mandela's embrace of the team was a brilliant, calculated political move for reconciliation for sure, but for the broader masses, the embrace of professional rugby remains, well, broad, but pretty shallow. And this historical legacy leads directly into one of the most politically charged debates in contemporary South African sport today. On one hand, to bridge deep racial inequalities, the government has instituted quota policies, often called transformation, which require teams to have representation from previously disadvantaged groups to overcome that racist past. But on the other hand, there is staunch opposition arguing for strict meritocracy. They believe that sporting outcomes and team selection should be determined solely on athletic merit, completely regardless of demographics. It's a highly complex, incredibly sensitive debate, and it has deep, deep roots in the country's history. So let's recap why understanding the profound legacy of this history is absolutely crucial. The sporting boycott did so much more than just cancel games. It empowered the oppressed masses by showing them they had real global support. It completely exposed the bigoted logic of apartheid on the world stage for everyone to see. And crucially, as Mandela noted early on, integrating sports helped convince the white minority that a democratic transition wouldn't literally end their way of life. Ultimately, it was a highly effective diplomatic weapon that helped bring down an entire regime. Which brings us to a final thought for us to chew on. Knowing how powerfully a soccer league, a table tennis federation, or a rugby tour shaped the destiny of an entire nation, does sport today still hold that same kind of political power? Can it still be used as a weapon for human rights? Or have we just relegated it back to being a game? It's a pretty fascinating question to reflect on as you sit down to watch your next weekend match. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. I really hope this sparked your curiosity to go out and learn even more about this incredible slice of history. Catch you next time.